To Sarah Tier, your question about what percentage of the parts that we design actually end up on the car, it's a little more complex than you might imagine, because it really does depend on which part of the company you're talking about. In aerodynamics, or in vehicle dynamics, maybe as much as 95% of what we do never goes anywhere near a car, because that's where we're exploring to find performance opportunities, and we have far more misses than hits. But in the design office, where we are taking those good ideas, the 5% that come out of the performance departments, then pretty much everything we design will go on the car and will work. So it really depends on where you're looking at in the company. Darth of Khan, apparently. I really enjoyed reading this question. What are the sort of mistakes armchair experts make about the sport? Because it's one of the things that we enjoy / are frustrated by when we see things that are just not quite on the money. I think probably the biggest one is that people focus on the outcomes. They focus on particular things like, does a car have a long wheelbase? Is it a high rake, a low rake, a low drag concept, a high drag concept? These are all just froth and meaningless, really, to whether or not a car is good. And the thing that people should be focusing on but don't is, how good is a team at learning? How good is a team at understanding the physics that govern making a fast racing car? Because the car is merely the product of the organization that produces it. And it's the collective knowledge and understanding of that organization that determines whether the car is fast, not a particular detail of it. So that's probably the thing that is most commonly frustrating for us in the questions that come our way. To aspiring F1 engineer, your question about what's the best way to jump from academic or school or other environments into being an F1 engineer. Well, I understand what that feels like, because that was true for me once, wondering how to do it. And it's been true for everyone who's around me in this team. It is a difficult hurdle, but it's not impossible. All the teams have an intake every year of young people and aspiring people like yourself who want to get into the sport. Apply to their HR departments and just see if you get lucky. Write to all the teams saying you'd love to work in F1. My advice would be, don't have a sense of entitlement. Everyone who applies to us and gets a job is in some way clever, good qualifications, and has got a lot to offer. So you won't be unusual if you're just putting forward good academic qualifications. But try to show that you've got a bit more. Try to show that you're willing to work tirelessly for a team, that you love working alongside other people, that you've got in your curriculum vitae, you've got lots of evidence to show that you have done unusual things, not the sort of normal cookie cutter that you might get from a graduate. Try to mark yourself out as someone that is just going to be a little different from the average candidate by the breadth of what you've taken on. To Colin Staples, you asked what single rule I would change, either sporting or technical, if I were able to. Well, first off, I wouldn't really muck around in the technical regulations. It's a bit of a mug's game. It's valuable if you want to try and make the cars safer, or if you want to speed them up or slow them down, but it's really, really difficult to make a technical change that will materially affect the way in which the cars race against one another. Sporting regulations, well, that's a very different prospect. And there, I would make one change. Everyone around me would probably hate me for it. I know Toto would definitely not support it, but I would say do away completely with the blue flags. It would make the races an absolute nightmare for a fast car, because as we came up to lap people, they wouldn't get out of our way. We would have to fight our way through them. And that would make every race interesting all the way through the race. It would also mean that teams would have to forge alliances with one another, and where you would have to be very, very nervous of teams that you'd fallen out with, which would make it politically incredibly intriguing as well. So such a change would be disastrous for us, but probably really, really interesting in the long term for the sport. George Netup, really, asking us if we can go a bit slower. I think you know the answer to that. We've got one duty as a racing team, and that's to go as fast as we can in qualifying, and then to go as fast as we have to in the race in order to win. And we're not going to change that approach anytime soon. Obviously, it would be great if we could have a proper fight every single weekend, but we're not going to slow down to achieve that. Stanley Hudson, you asked what is the biggest misunderstanding people have about the way that the cars perform. It's hard for me to know the proper answer to that because I haven't surveyed all the people to know, but I think probably if I just base it on my experience of talking to friends, family, and a few things like this, then probably the thing that I guess most people don't really understand is just how incredible all the cars on the grid are. Every single team, from the back to the front, every one of those machines is extreme in a way that is hard to comprehend unless you work inside a team, or unless you physically get out to a circuit, stand at one of the fast corners and be really close to it, watching it as it goes through the corner, because only then do you really, really appreciate how utterly amazing the performance is. It doesn't come across fully on the television, except maybe when they're having a crash. When they're crashing, you realize the energy that is involved in the car, because it comes off the track and it turns and turns and turns, and when it hits the barrier, it's still traveling. The cars are remarkable things, and when they're really flying in qualifying, it's something to behold. And I don't think people properly get just how extreme they are. Kev, and that's Kev B91, you've asked what role does machine learning and data analytics play in the life of a Formula 1 team? Well, I guess we're not really very different to the rest of society. Machine learning is something which is a relatively new technology, but which is getting a foothold in so many aspects of life, and it's no different inside the Formula 1 team than it is everywhere else. It isn't yet fully in the core, the mainstream core of the calculations we make, because much of the fundamental physics of our car is quite amenable to writing fundamental equations which allow you to predict the performance quite accurately from a physical basis. But there are parts of our world where it is much harder to make predictions from fundamental physical equations, and where pattern recognition is more of a thing. So in certain niche parts of our process, we're starting to see machine learning now doing a better job than we were able to do previously just by hand. And that's a trend that is only going to grow over time as we start to bring it to bear more and more upon the mainstream of what we do. TSM727, you asked what sparked my interest in Formula 1 and whether or not I had a particular engineering role model that I looked up to. The reason that I was interested in Formula 1 is really simple. I was a massive fan of it as a boy and completely loved it all the way through my teens. And I happened to be studying engineering at university and just hoped that I would be able to use the engineering skills I'd acquired at university and persuade someone to give me a job in Formula 1, because then I could combine something I was a massive fanboy for with earning some money as well. And that's how it worked out, and it was really a very happy choice and something that has rewarded me greatly as a result. Did I have any particular engineering figure that I looked up to? Not especially, although I liked all sorts of engineering-y type topics, so reading slide rule as a boy from Neville Shute, or reading about Barnes Wallis or R.J. Mitchell. The great designers of the Second World War mainly were the ones that had caught my attention as boys, but not really connected to Formula 1. BRDP2, you have asked what we do to prepare for a track that we've not been to before and that we weren't even expecting to be on this year's calendar. It's it's not that different to what we do for a track that we have been to before and we were expecting to be on the F1 calendar. So we make sure we know exactly what the layout of the track is. For some of them, we'll have really detailed track scans that we have purchased from third parties. For others, we'll just have the driving line around the circuit. But whichever of those two sets of information we have, we will be able to do a lot of simulation beforehand to work out what wing level we need, to work out what sort of springs and bars we're going to need at that track, and to figure out all the sorts of fundamental things like what sort of fuel consumption can we expect, how the earth system will deploy, etc., etc. Huge amount of housekeeping that goes on for every track, no matter whether we've been to that track before or not. I guess the thing that's different is that when we go to a track that we have been to before, we have a sort of backlog of this is what happened last year, this is where there was a trap or somewhere you could stumble, these were mistakes we've made in the past, let's not make them again. Whereas when you go to somewhere brand new, you don't have that sort of little checklist of things not to do. But most of it's the same, and for a driver, they sort of don't care. They are freakishly good at getting in a car. Doesn't matter what track it is, what circuit it is, whether they've been to it or not. Within a few laps of going around that track, they will have figured out the fastest way around the track. They will have learnt all of their braking points. They will have learnt the driving line, and it will be as if they've never raced anywhere else. So it's not as different as you might imagine. Lifecake 16, you've asked what is the most challenging thing about our car on the track this season. It isn't actually that different to last season or the season before. The single biggest thing you can do to have a good weekend, or conversely to really screw up your weekend, is get the tyres right. If you don't get them right, you screw it up. If you get them right, then your weekend should work out okay. And by getting them right, I mean making sure that the ratio of wear on the front axle to the rear axle is well positioned so you're not wearing out one faster than the other. Making sure that you're threading the needle on the temperature so that you've got the tyres performing in their optimal window. Too hot, they drop grip. Too cold, they drop grip. And you get it right, they perform really sweetly. And it can be a thing that takes you from having a really glorious weekend to being absolutely awful. And so that is the biggest challenge, and it's the thing that if we slip just the slightest amount, then we will not do well at a weekend and others will go past us in the blink of an eye. Jevon Sneed, you've asked a couple of questions. First of all, what is the most underrated development in car design? And secondly, have we considered flame decals on the side of our car to make it go faster? Well, to the second question, no, but we have made a pretty cool paint job this year, and it looks fast even when the car's standing still. But to the first question, what's the most underrated aspect of Formula 1 design? You might be expecting me to think of particular innovations that you see on the track. It won't be any of those. By far and away, the biggest thing that never gets talked about is the fact that Formula 1 has gone over the last 20 years from being an entirely empirical process of design where you just sort of blindly shoot in the dark to try and produce a car that is faster, to being one that is much more science-led and understanding-led. So the biggest development by far has been a greater physical understanding of the equations of motion and the physical properties that govern whether it is fast or not. And that never gets talked about, but it is the thing that really separates the front of the grid from the back of the grid, and certainly is a world of difference between the sport of today and the sport of 20 years ago. To Seratir, who asks if we're lucky enough to have a quick car at the moment, do we ever look down the back of the grid, and if we do, can we spot the mistakes that they made, and can we see the reasons why they're going slower? It's a sort of uncomfortable question, that really, because it presupposes that we're standing in judgment over other teams in that fashion. And there's many reasons why teams end up where they end up, but you can see certain things that maybe you wouldn't have done on their cars, but mostly if you want to understand why the cars are spread the way they're spread, you have to look at the organisation of those teams and the budgets they enjoy. And you see teams that for the money they have are doing much better than they should, and you see the opposite as well. And nearly always the differences there are because of the way in which the team has structured itself and the way in which it's approached its work, rather than picking out bits and bobs from the car itself.